everyone. I am Dr. Jessica Stansberry. I am the Director for Teaching and Learning Excellence with our Center for Excellence in Learning, Teaching, and Technology here at the University of Baltimore. I want to give a quick shout out to our co-collaborators in this AI in Practice webinar series, which is Johns Hopkins University and UMBC. So thank you for that continued partnership in this process. Our speaker today, very excited for, is Dr. Denise Turley. She is the Vice President of Technology at the United States Chamber of Commerce. She is a dynamic leader in artificial intelligence, technology, and leadership. She is recognized as LinkedIn's top voice for AI. Dr. Turley combines her corporate expertise with academic insights as an assistant professor at the University of Southwest, where she emphasizes inclusive, technology-driven education. She is also an accomplished author, and she advocates for ethical AI practices and equity across industries, inspiring transformative change through her leadership and vision. We are excited that Dr. Turley will lead our final 2024 edition of our AI in Practice webinar series. And with that, please welcome Dr. Denise Turley.
Jessica, thank you. It's a little bit crazy to think that we are at the end of 2024 almost. So thank you for the introduction. I really feel quite privileged that I get to talk to you all about a topic that I really love. And so I use AI every day. Literally every day, generative AI. I love it. And it's not something to fear. I hope that I will leave you with a feeling of empowerment, of encouragement, of the ability to lean in if you haven't already. And if you already have, to continue leaning into this technology that really is transformative. And I really enjoy speaking about it. So, we all know about generative AI, right? That's the new, that's the sexy. AI has been here for a long time. We've been developing solutions with AI for years, but it's this new generative AI that has us all a little bit intrigued and pumped up. So it really has extraordinary potential in a way that we've never really seen before in technology to transform our daily lives. But we have to make sure that that impact is implemented responsibly and inclusively. And so we'll talk through a little bit about that as I walk through with you today my version of what I think an AI-assisted day might look like and what the future of our lives might look like. So when we think about from a business perspective, at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I have a team and we work on developing generative AI and technology solutions for the entire enterprise. And so we're constantly evaluating now what this means to our business, how can we transform, how can we be more effective, more efficient, and how can we serve our members better? And so it's not just about education and teaching our students, it's also about schools are businesses, right? And so there are ways that we can also use generative AI to make our jobs easier and to make the administration easier so that ultimately we're able to serve our students in a way that gives them more quality and hopefully improved education without, of course, losing that personal touch. So when we think about business, some of the ways that we're going to continue to see generative AI transform is going to be in this hyper-personalized content. So as the AI learns more about you, more about your preferences, more about your likes, your dislikes, it's going to start creating bespoke content. So imagine, for example, a day when Netflix is able to create movies or content on the fly where the endings and the storylines perhaps change specifically to you and what's going to engage you the most or entertain you the most. There's also the ability now for us to have even more enhanced productivity than what we were able to get with AI So now we've got agentic AI, which can be autonomous agents that are doing entire workflows on our behalf. So imagine, for example, automating accounts payable processes, but not just from the invoice recognition piece. We've been doing that for years, but all the way through payment distribution. We can also think about automation in areas such as onboarding new students or onboarding employees. And then, of course, we have the potential to really analyze and go through all of huge data sets to come up with on the moment decision-making capabilities. So we can analyze data today. We've been able to do that for years. But what's new is the speed at which we can now just go through tremendous volumes of data to come up with quality analysis. And so imagine, for example, this isn't really that far off, but perhaps UPS, FedEx, the Amazon truck that shows up to my house almost every day is now getting to me in an autonomous, automated way, right? So it knows where to go. The delivery person no longer has to drive. They're sort of freed of that responsibility, and they can focus on navigating package delivery or doing something else. And so the idea and the hope might be that we get our packages in a way that is more efficient, that is safer. And, we see less fatigue from drivers, whereas today they're driving around 9, 10, 11 plus hours out of the day. Particularly when we start to come across these times right now with Christmas. I don't know if any of you have done any Black Friday shopping, but the Amazon trucks and the FedEx trucks, they really go into overdrive around this time. So it's not just the business, it's also innovations that are coming in healthcare. Generative AI is really transforming the way that we work, the way that we learn, and the way that we interact. So I'm really excited about some of these areas that are using technology more for social good. And so we imagine, a time when we really get to rapid cancer detection. Pancreatic cancer, for example, is something that is very, very hard to detect early on. And with this new technology, there is the capability that we can understand biometric data in seconds and understand if something is off that might lead to more diagnostic exams and potentially identify some of these diseases, and then have a treatment that's customized that can lead to higher outcomes. So remember, we talked about hyper-personalization with Netflix. And if that didn't resonate with you, then maybe it's the hyper-personalized care that we'll be able to get from our doctors, from our health practitioners. We can get to a point to there's going to be no more of that generic, take one of these for 2 weeks and come back if it isn't cleared, right? You get the standard antibiotics and you hope that it goes away. Now that there can really be some precision that's really focused on you and your specific biochemistry. So there's also an opportunity to have expanded access. So if we think about some patients that are in remote areas of countries where perhaps it's difficult to get to a doctor's office, or maybe there are a few doctor's offices around, with telemedicine now, we'll be able to service more of that population just using the cell phone. So AI chatbots can interact, they can ask questions, they can receive information, actually triage patients in a way that we haven't been able to reach them before. Now, we've had AI chatbots for some time as well, but they just weren't particularly good. I don't know if any of you have ever found yourself in that never-ending repeat cycle. If you ever call your bank and they're asking you, what's your bank account number or what's your address? And then I say it, and as I'm speaking through my address, it's sort of interrupting me. And then at the end, it's been 30 minutes and I have to start again. So we've had AI and AI solutions around for a while. They just weren't good. And generative AI, conversational AI is really what's allowing us to have these types of solutions where we can have personalized care in a very intelligent way that we didn't have before. So there's also opportunities for us to improve sustainability. So again, we're thinking about AI, not just for some of the business solutions, but also to do good for us as a planet. And so in Kenya, they're doing some experimentation using AI to analyze soil conditions. They understand weather patterns. They also understand the crop disease. They can analyze the type of disease and then also suggest options to eradicate that disease precisely and quickly. That's life-saving in places like Kenya. There's also the opportunity for us to have improved awareness around disaster prediction so that we now understand different climate models. We can forecast extreme weather events, but we can actually get the location of where it will hit in a lot more precision than what we have to do today. So there are many smart cities around that are starting to explore with technology that will also help customize evacuation routes. So it's not just important that we know that a disaster is coming, but governments and cities and states have to understand, well, how do I now communicate with the population and get them to a safe place? And so that's what smart cities can do. And with real-time data, we can maybe navigate Denise to a different route than perhaps I've navigated somebody else to, because I now know by monitoring traffic patterns that there's a delay, there's a crash, or when I recently had to evacuate Florida, there was actually no gas in the gas stations. There's also the ability for us to improve energy usage. So with smart cities and smart systems and usage grids, there's an opportunity that we know about power distribution, and there's potential for us to distribute power only when we need it. We've got an increase in electric vehicles. A lot of people plug those vehicles up in their homes overnight, as an example. And instead of, distributing power consistently, instead it's sort of like a just-in-time energy distribution, like the inventory systems. So that's business. We talked a little bit about healthcare. We've talked a little bit about sustainability. Generative AI is here. It is here to stay. And even though we sometimes might want to just put our heads in the sand and pretend it isn't here, it's not going anywhere. So when we think about education, there's a number of challenges that we have, and this isn't all of them. It's just some of them that are represented in the struggles that we've had. So we don't have enough time often as educators. The workload is really very high. Sometimes students are complaining about outdated textbooks. As soon as you print them, oftentimes they're already out of date. And some of our textbooks do have use cases and material that are a couple of years old. Sometimes grading isn't as quick as students would like. We're certainly in a culture of instant gratification. So anything less than 10 minutes is probably slow. There's a lack of detailed feedback. There are some complaints that we're not really equipping students for the jobs of the future. There's a tremendous amount of financial burden for some students, and some may even argue that some of the course content is irrelevant. And lastly, in today's education, most of our courses are cookie cutter. They're standardized, they're one size fits all for many good reasons. And so when we think about how generative AI has the potential to change that, I'm sure you guys may have heard some of this before in our prior sessions, is, we really think that we're going to be able to have an adaptive curriculum so that when I'm going into a course, I really get a lesson that's customized to me. It understands where my strengths are, where my weaknesses are, as I'm interacting with course content, it can either increase the difficulty or give me additional help if I'm struggling. So we will have the ability to meet students' needs exactly where they are. We also know that not everyone learns in the same way. So we'll have the ability to present course content in a variety of methods, which today is really challenging for us to do with our current resources. We'll have real-time insights. So as educators, you'll be able to gain insights into where your students might be struggling, where they're doing really well, and where maybe you might be able to come in and augment their learning experience. Technology is here, AI is here. We need to think about AI as our assistants, right? It shouldn't be here or thought of to replace educators. It should be our co-pilots, right? We still need educators, we still need humans there, and we still need to maintain that level of connection with our students. So AI is also enabling us to have more global accessibility, removing some barriers for some students who have certain learning disabilities. I had a great example about a month ago when a friend of mine who is visually impaired, for the last 25 years, they've been unable to read a menu or to go shopping and buy anything for themselves because they have no idea what anything looks like, right? Obviously. And so they recently got some AI assisted glasses, and she was so excited because in the first time in 15 years, she was able to go to a restaurant and be able to read the menu herself, or at least her glasses were able to read and speak that menu to her. And then she was able to go to a store and hold a pair of shoes and know that they were green and know the style of them without having to rely on her husband. So there's tremendous opportunity of this technology to be used for good. So the future's already here for some, right? We've got some schools that are already starting to lean into personalized learning and doing the experimentation. We have some schools who are experimenting with real-time AI created textbooks. So instead of having to rely on those textbooks that are sort of mass produced, right, the ones we're using now, imagine that you'll be able to create a textbook and update it for every course if we so choose. And it can be done in a matter of hours or certainly days, and sometimes perhaps minutes. So this technology has the power to free us and to solve some of the challenges that I talked about in that earlier slide. So we know that there's a ton of things that are really exciting, that are really good about the potential for generative AI and agentic AI. But we want to make sure that we are proceeding with some caution here, right? We want to make sure that we're understanding the bias that comes within AI. So we all have bias. There is almost no way to completely eradicate bias, that is for sure. But we can certainly mitigate the bias that we have in our data. And bias is inherited from training data and also from the bias of the people who are doing that reinforcement learning with the machine learning. So it exists, we know it exists. The thing with the bias is it does do harm. So about a month ago, I was in a webinar and we were exploring image creation. And in the image creation, we did a prompt of a boy going to school with their dog. And we gave the boy a name. Based on the name that we chose, the AI generated an image of a person that was, let's just say, quite typical to that name. When we changed just the name, the image changed quite drastically to be something that sort of, it was negative stereotypes reinforced with the image just by changing a name, and that's that bias. Another example that we did, was to create an image of a room full of doctors, and that room full of doctors were all one race, all one skin color, right? And so maybe you think that that isn't too bad, but I would say that that can cause emotional distress and harm if you are somebody from a minority group. You don't see yourself represented in these images, and then you start to question whether or not you fit in. There are images with self-worth. There's a ton of images, right, that just don't reflect diversity. And so that's some of the issue that we have when there's bias in the data. So what we need to encourage and where we need to get to is having more inclusive teams. We need to have more diverse voices in the rooms when we are training the data, when we're finding data sets, and also when decisions are being made, right? We need to have inclusive teams that are representative of the society that we live in. And that is not happening today. We also need to make sure that our data set is inclusive. So curating data sets that are representative of the whole and are inclusive. And sometimes that might also mean generating and using synthetic data. It's true that some of our historical data is going to contain the bias of our history, and that might not be the data that we want to train the model on. And so there is more movement towards generating synthetic data that doesn't include some of our historical bias. So equity and access. So I'd like to suggest to you that access to AI, access to generative AI is a necessity, particularly for disadvantaged groups. We'll want to make sure that these groups do have the opportunity for education, job training, and economic advancement. So as we are evaluating our policies for AI use, we want to consider that as well, right? The ability to read was weaponized against Black people, right, back in our history. We don't want to see that happening again with AI. Lack of access really can just continue to widening the digital divide. So we want to make sure that as you're thinking about AI, that we have an inclusive approach. We've got inclusive education for all, and particularly for those disadvantaged and minorities. So I mentioned before that, listen, AI is great. It's going to be transformative, but it can't do everything. There are definitely lots of applications where we wouldn't use AI and perhaps where we shouldn't use AI. Some of it may also end up being personal preference. I happen to have a electronic vehicle that recently is able to drive itself. I love that. I love to be driven around. My husband, on the other hand, loves driving. He would never use a car that drove him around. So some of that is personal choice. So AI has limitations, as I mentioned. AI understands patterns, right? It can detect patterns, it can generate content, but it also makes mistakes. It is not infallible. It still has to rely on humans. There are also really dire consequences sometimes when AI is being used to make decisions in areas that we're not quite ready for. So we talked about bias, we talked about disadvantaged groups, and some populations that traditionally have more adverse effects and outcomes than others. And so if we imagine, for example, making loan decisions, and if we automate those decisions, sometimes there is bias in the data, and based on your address or your zip code, you might be denied a loan, right? We wouldn't want to automate those types of decision-making without humans in the loop because the data has bias, as we mentioned. There's been some use cases where there's bias against certain resumes when there are females versus males, or the names on the resumes are more indicative of certain groups. And so they are either discounted or get reduced points or even disqualified. We've seen some examples also in smart cities where we're using facial recognition, but that facial recognition is not infallible. It's making mistakes with people with different skin colors where it hasn't been appropriately trained on. So we can see that bias exists in the data. There are really life-impacting outcomes that can happen if we start to rely too quickly on AI, and AI has limits. It's really important that we ultimately have human judgment and human oversight to make sure that the technology is operating in a way that does no harm. So future ready, and are we prepared? When I think about the future workforce, I know a number of people are a little bit scared. We experience that all the time. People are worried. It's real. I'm not sure how this technology is going to impact my life, how it's going to impact my livelihood. And so then we see people who either don't want to adopt generative AI at all, right? Why would I adopt it if I thought that it was going to take my job? That doesn't make any sense. And then I'm also seeing what I'm calling silent adoption. So I'm seeing people on teams who are adopting AI or they're exploring with AI, but they're not raising their hand and admitting that. And they're doing that for a number of reasons. Some of the reasons are shame. Some people still think that if they didn't create something themselves, then that's sort of shameful. And there are others who, like I mentioned, they have fear. They don't understand what the impact will be, and so therefore they are adopting it in silence. But I want to encourage everyone to adopt it because this is where the future of the workforce is going. We're seeing more and more jobs come out where they are it's listed as optional right now for AI experience, but we are seeing more jobs that are listing AI as a required skill. So technology is going to be able to replace some of the work that we do, but not all of the work. I would hope that much of the work that AI will replace is really the mundane, repetitive tasks that many of us don't want to do anyway, and it kind of frees us up to do more higher level critical thinking. So critical thinking is a skill set that's going to be very, very high in demand. We're going to see more jobs coming up around ethical AI, responsible use, and oversight. Even though technology is here, technology right now cannot figure out all of the problems or all of the use cases that it should be used for. And so we need people to do that. Collaboration is also really important and going to be highly in demand. We need good communication skills, dare I say great communication skills. We need the ability to bring together teams to be able to have conversations with technical people, with business people, with educators, with students. And so those skills are going to be really important. They already are now, but they'll become more important. So job skills will shift. Listen, some jobs will go away. There's no doubt about that. But there's also going to be a lot of new jobs that are created, jobs that we haven't even thought about. This is no different to what we've experienced historically when we've gone through other changes, when the internet came about, when the calculator came about, when the fax machine and the smartphone came around. We've been here before as far as adapting. As humans, that's something that we do very, very well is adapt. And this is just something else that we need to adapt to. So we need to learn how to work effectively alongside AI, with AI as our assistant, not the other way around. So as I mentioned, we want to make sure that we're focusing on building an equitable AI future. That means that we have diverse teams that are developing these solutions, not only diverse teams that are developing the solutions, but diverse teams who are in the room, in leadership positions that are making decisions about these systems. We want to make sure that we keep humans in the loop, right? Humans have need to be in there with the critical thinking, with the oversight, and making sure ultimately that we're doing no harm to our population. We want to make sure that we've got accessible tools so that we are making sure that we're building inclusive solutions. So what's next? When you think about as educators, I wanted to make sure that I walked through some steps that I would think about when I'm incorporating AI or increasing AI or scaling AI. So carefully evaluate all AI tools. I think every week there are several hundred new solutions that come out. Generative AI is reducing the barrier to entry for solution development. What used to be a couple of hundred people developing technical solutions can now be just 2 people or even 1 person at the end of a computer. And so that means there's a lot of competition and there are a lot of options for you to choose from. But I want to make sure that you guys know to evaluate the tool's effectiveness and its suitability for your school's specific needs. Make sure that you're conducting vendor assessments. You're looking at that vendor's track record. You're looking at that vendor's ability to be around for the long term. And you're looking at their reputation. There is a tremendous amount of excitement and a number of people do want to rush and just start using these AI tools. But when you're incorporating AI at your school or in your institution, it does make sense to pause and think it through thoroughly. You want to make sure that you are asking the critical questions about how is this provider mitigating bias? So how are they making sure that the outcomes, that the tools that you might expose to your students or your faculty or your staff is as bias-free as possible? And there are solutions out there. You want to make sure that you don't just take their word for it, right? That you request evidence and audits that demonstrate fairness and inclusivity in the tool's outcomes. As I mentioned, you'll want to think about when you implement your solution, start really small. So start with a pilot project where you understand what is your definition of success, right? So you want to get executive buy-in. You'll want to start off really small in a controlled environment before you do a full-scale rollout. Gather feedback from as many voices as possible within reason so that you understand from educators, from students, from administrators, whoever your stakeholders are, and then refine from there. Training is really important. There are a number of use cases, and I hear from leaders all the time that they've implemented a thing, right? They've implemented a Gen AI solution. Quite often it's a chatbot, perhaps ChatGPT, perhaps Bing Copilot, but they're not seeing the adoption. They're not seeing the types of use that they'd like to see. And that's often because they've just implemented a tool without really carefully thinking about what's the strategy around training, what's the strategy around adoption, and what's the strategy around continued improvement. So you'll want to make sure that you're evaluating how are you providing comprehensive and ongoing training to educators on how to effectively use these tools. It is not enough to just simply give them a subscription to a tool and have them go figure it out for themselves. We're seeing a lot of problems in that area. The tools are also changing so quickly that you put a tremendous burden on your educators and your staff if the expectation is that they just train themselves. You must consider a comprehensive training program. Even when people have sort of mastered prompting, I'm seeing a lot of people are struggling with use case development, right? So I know how to prompt, but now how do I really start embracing this tool and gaining effective and efficiency? People are struggling in that area. You'll also want to make sure that you are equipping your students with the skills to critically engage with AI so that there isn't this over-reliance. The last thing we want to see happen is that students are going straight to a prompt and taking that output and copying and pasting that into their assignment. Even though there are some tools that claim to be able to detect AI generated content, it's really not true. And as AI gets better, and even just with very limited prompting, it's easy to humanize and create content using generative AI that doesn't sound like AI and is not detectable by solutions like Turnitin. And it's going to get better, right? So you'll want to make sure that you are training not only your educators, not only the staff and your administrative functions, but also training your students, making sure that you're talking about responsible use, the existence of bias, how to recognize bias, and how to mitigate bias. Data privacy is also huge. There's a ton of solutions, as I just mentioned, and often the free solutions do not afford you any data privacy. So make sure that you only collect and you only input data that is absolutely essential for the decision or your use case that you're using, right? Don't go putting in all your personal information, uploading all your personal documents. And, even if you're using, I don't know, resumes or anything personally, you'll want to anonymize that. So take out your name, take out your address, take out anything that is personal, particularly when you're using free solutions. Always evaluate these tools, data privacy and security policies. You guys already know this, right? This is not anything new as far as making sure that you've got compliance, you've got your annual training, you've got your regular training, and generative AI is no different. In fact, generative AI could end up being a little bit more risky than some of the other technologies that we have. So be really careful. So the other thing I wanted to mention is making sure that you're thinking about security and vendor assessments. Again, no doubt you're getting lots of emails, or you're seeing things on LinkedIn, or people are messaging you depending on your position and they want to demo you a tool. You want to make sure that you're doing regular security assessments. And if you don't have the staff to do that, that you contract with someone, so that you are safeguarding your school, your students, and your team. You'll want to verify that those vendors do adhere to any and all data security standards. I can see some questions coming in, but I know I'm going to pause for Julia. But as I'm getting ready to wrap up now and hopefully leave some time for questions, I just want to share with you guys my perspective on this, in that the ability to have access to information, to have access to new technology, it really shouldn't be a privilege. I see it more as a civil right. And I see that empowering every student with AI literacy is really something that isn't a choice. I believe that to be our own moral and educational imperative to do so. So I want to thank you guys for having me. This is something that I love talking about. I know I covered a lot of topics. I want to encourage each of you to be bold, to speak up, to ask those sometimes challenging questions about inclusivity, about bias in your data, and making sure that you're making the right decisions as you move forward. Nobody has all of the answers right now. This stuff is new. It's 2 years in the making. And so we're all trying to navigate this new world and figure out, what is the best way to us to really start thinking about changing the way they teach, changing the way that we interact with our students, and changing the way that we interact even personally with generative AI. I use it for everything. Thanksgiving recipes, my shopping list, planning my itinerary for my travel. So I hope that you'll find some good use for it.
Dr. Turley, thank you so much. This has been really informative, really great presentation. We really appreciate you speaking with us today. So as you mentioned, we do have a couple questions in our Q&A. If our audience, if you have others you'd like to throw in there, please go ahead. I am going to start with one that's a little bit more related, just to touch on again something that you recently brought up about data privacy. So we did have somebody saying, since the US doesn't have the equivalent of GDPR, it's not likely going to be coming in the future. So how do we ensure data privacy from a higher ed standpoint?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, we don't have GDPR if your students are just US based, but we do have good frameworks for data privacy and data standards. So I would say that we don't necessarily have to wait for a regulation or a rule. Instead, we can be proactive about how we think about data privacy. Number one, working with your IT team. If you don't have an IT team, working with a consultant to make sure that one, don't put it into your tool if you do not use it. I know it is very tempting to just maybe copy and paste or upload student assignments. Don't do that. What you'll want to make sure that you're doing as far as data privacy is don't use free tools. They usually don't offer you any protection. If your school decides to pay for a subscription, that's the best way to go. Have an AI use policy for your school so that teachers know it is not okay to just go out and use a tool like ChatGPT that is not sanctioned by the university. If you pay for a subscription like ChatGPT for education or even ChatGPT Pro, then it does not train on your data. Or if you're a Microsoft, if you use Microsoft and you use Microsoft Copilot with an enterprise license, it does not train on your data. And so you can then input whatever you like within reason, right? Because data breaches happen every day. So even a company like Microsoft, who promises to not train on your data and your data stays, within your own environment in the cloud, they too can experience data breaches. So anonymize the data when you put it in, and the best practice is to not use student data unless you really have a solution that you have worked with your IT team and you've got those security safeguards in place as far as making sure that the data isn't going anywhere.
Thank you. So, kind of going along with that, I just saw a question pop up, and I want to keep on the same theme before transitioning to some of the other questions. So, how does there's a question a little bit more about how you were talking about the privacy with paid versions versus free versions. Can you go a little bit more into that? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, so with the free versions, you often don't get any options about not training on your data. It depends on the tool because, as I mentioned before, you guys all know there are hundreds of tools out there. So it's really important that you take a look at the data privacy and security policies of the tool that you use. We'll talk about ChatGPT because I use that a lot and I tend to think it is one of the best tools out there depending on your use case. And so when you pay for a subscription, I use ChatGPT for Teams, it does not train on your data. If you get ChatGPT for enterprise or ChatGPT for your education, it comes with a license and it will not train on your own organization's data. You can also, there are also within your preferences and settings within ChatGPT, you can choose whether or not it knows about you, how much it retains in memory. So there are settings that you can go in and toggle on and off depending on your level of subscription and the tool that you use.
Thank you. Going to one of our earlier questions, this viewer acknowledges, the tremendous potential as well as the areas of concern that you discussed throughout your presentation. Do you have any concerns over the potential of AI to be used by bad actors, so including political leaders, to engage in psychological or physical or economic warfare against perceived enemies? So, kind of thinking on that bigger political scale.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's definitely something that I am concerned about. There are a number of things that I'm concerned about with generative AI. It has so much potential. It's so powerful that it is inevitable that there will be some bad actors that attempt to use this for a variety of different things. We've got already deep fakes going around. Just yesterday, right, Sora was released and then quickly pulled back. You're going to be able to generate even better and convincing videos. We've got avatars in AI, so it might start to look like I'm actually saying something or doing something in the space where I'm actually not even there, right? So I am absolutely concerned about that. We are relying right now on some of the solution providers like OpenAI, like Anthropic, like Google, who are starting to develop ways so that there are indicators within the technology so that we know it's AI generated. It's not mandated, it's not required. We're just hoping that there's going to be more of that ethical and responsible use where they just take that on as creators of these solutions. So the short answer is yes. But I also recognize that the train has already left the station with this technology and there is no stopping it.
Thank you. Similar kind of vein in terms of concerns of what's been happening kind of more recently with AI use. Um, One of our viewers is interested in hearing your take on stories that came out earlier this week about the latest version of ChatGPT showing signs of deceptiveness and self-protection behavior.
Yeah, I mean, in the same vein, I think it is very scary as we start to think these are like the movies that we watched years ago when we start to worry about, you know, robots taking over. I think that the fear is valid. There's been the horrific story about what happened to the young man who developed a very close relationship. I'm sure many of you are aware with AI. People are forming very strong connections with generative AI. There are a couple of people internationally who have married generative AI, right? They've created these custom partners that they can interact with in ways that feel very real to them, and are forming emotional connections. So I think all of those things are certainly things for us to be concerned about. I think it's real. I think it's a real threat. And I think that it's things for us to be aware of and be very careful. I do think that we'll see more regulations and policy that will come out.
Thank you. Moving into the direction of accessibility and um, bridging the digital divide and making sure that there's opportunity for all to be able to be developing digital literacy, AI literacy. This is specifically about areas where there might be older technology, older phones, older computer, lower connectivity with the internet, perhaps in underserved countries. Um, where do you see kind of the disadvantage, or how might this impact the disadvantage for the foreseeable future, people being able to interact with AI? So that kind of digital divide, the access to resources.
Yeah, I think it's the same, right? So listen, this isn't solving for everything, right? If there already isn't internet access, cell phone access, poverty reasons that kind of prohibit access to these systems, then those things will still be there, right? It's not going to solve for all of that. But in the scenarios where they do exist, it has the potential for good. It has the potential to bring customized learning in remote places where at least they do have internet access and maybe can have school or education on their own terms in their own timeline. So I think it can solve for that. It can solve with some of the accessibility issues with vision, with hearing, as we talked about, but it isn't going to solve for everything. There is the opportunity, if over time we are trying to make sure that we all have a voice in using technology for good, that we might be able to impact some of the poverty in certain regions, some of the infrastructure, so that some of those areas are able to be more self-sufficient and have technology. But it in and of itself will not solve it.
Thank you. I'm going to actually bounce to Dr. Jessica Stansberry for her question first, and then we've got a couple more in our Q&A.
Thank you, Julia. I just want to follow up on something. So, there's lots of questions in here about, the powerful impact of AI and the scary and deceptive side of AI, which is, as you stated, a valid fear. It's not a fear that we can overlook. In having that valid fear and knowing that, there is validity in that, how do we balance that with still, trying to get our educators to move forward with generative AI to help our students learn and be prepared for the workforce? That's a constant battle I think we see in the higher education landscape is we do have these fears. The media also perpetuates those fears more than, what we even really know. And then we have the other side where it's our responsibility to make sure that students are prepared and understand this tool so that they're not left behind. So what would be your words of wisdom in that area for those that are watching?
That's really a great question. It's a valid concern, but I would take it back to, I think it is our responsibility as educators. Our job is to educate our students and position them in a way that they can have success, right? And so I think we're doing a disservice if we withhold this technology from them. It is here. It's not going anywhere. The train has left the station, as I mentioned already. So I think, I don't know how, maybe I'm aging myself, but does anyone remember the dot-com bubble? Does anyone remember how scared we were in December? Was it 1999 that nothing was going to work when we hit, I think it was the year 2000, I can't remember. And guess what? We're still here. Nothing, literally nothing happened. ATM still worked. I still logged on for the computer in the morning, right? So I think that while we should have fears and we should pay attention to them, we have to also rationalize them, because not all fears and not all risks are things that realistically will happen, right? So I think we have to move forward in a balanced way, protecting your privacy, of course, as I mentioned before. But as educators, it is our job to educate, and I believe we have a moral imperative to make sure we are educating our students and preparing them to be successful. If we do not educate them on generative AI, how will they be able to even protect themselves from a future risk, right?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go with two more questions that are in our Q&A, a little bit in the same vein with each other. So the first is, navigating, you've mentioned there's hundreds of tools and more pop up each day. Do you have any advice about making choices on how to choose which tool to focus on or which direction to go, which one to adopt, when it's still unclear which ones ultimately might be the best fit for a certain task?
That's a really great question. And so, we do this all the time, right? I think I mentioned, so I have a team, I oversee technology. And so we work on developing solutions all the time at my organization. And so I start off with use case, right? So don't use the tool just because, but understand what it is that you want to do with it. Most of what can be done with these AI tools can be done with a tool like ChatGPT or Bing Copilot, right? Most of what can be done. The other sort of cool tools that are out there that are the sexy stuff, right? Text to video generation. We don't necessarily need that. So we can play around with it, but it isn't something necessarily that we need in our courses or to introduce that risk to our school. So I would say, evaluate the reputation of the company behind the solution, right? It's back to those steps that I walked through before. You'll want to make sure that they're safeguarding your data and your privacy. ChatGPT is, I don't know what it is, $20 a month or something. For me, it's money well spent to know that I have some control or perceived control about how my data is being used. And most of what ChatGPT can do, I can use it for hundreds and thousands of use cases. So just because there's a tool that's out there that's the latest, greatest thing, it can be super overwhelming to go and keep exploring all of these other tools. I'd actually suggest that you don't. Just find maybe one or two that you need based on your use case. And hopefully, if not in 2024, as many haven't, but hopefully in 2025, your institution might be considering adopting tools at the institution level so that you're not having to make those decisions as an individual.
Thank you so much. And just to be mindful of time, this will be our last question. If you do have other questions for Dr. Turley, she shared her LinkedIn information, and we will be sending some follow-up after this session tomorrow for our registrants. But the last one, kind of going in that same vein, looking at how any examples of AI tools being used in universities and college settings who work with other employers and industries to make sure that they're set up for the skill set, for the literacy that's needed in this adjusting workspace and workplace where AI is having a major impact. Do you know of any examples of that kind of trajectory?
Can you ask that question again, Julia? I think I may have gotten a little bit lost on the specific.
Sure, sure. So looking at where AI tools are being used in university and college settings, who also work with employers and industries so that students are educated with the knowledge or skills that are needed for jobs that are impacted by AI.
I think it's all very new right now, and we're still somewhat of a guessing game. So there are a lot. I think it's still disjointed. I haven't seen, and it doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means I haven't seen them yet. I am seeing and hearing of use cases where universities are, of course, implementing AI for their students and their faculty. I've also seen some universities that are implementing or creating course content around teaching AI. It's really, really challenging though, because AI continues to change, right? So we're seeing people who are coming out with prompt engineering, which isn't really going to be a thing in the future. We needed prompt engineering, you know, as layman's terms a year ago, but the technology has gotten so good now that most of us don't need to be prompt engineers. I am what I describe as a lazy prompter. I am super lazy and I just iterate on a conversation because it is a conversational AI, right? So I just go back and forth until I have what I need. So I don't think I'm seeing any of that tightly aligned just yet. I'm seeing a lot of organizations that are doing sort of what the University of Baltimore is doing, which is really very commendable. And coming up with opportunities where they can give the training and the continuing education to their faculty and then sort of encourage that for their students.
Thank you so much. We have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to turn things back to Dr. Jessica Stansberry to close us up.
Okay, great, thank you. I did see one more question again in the chat, and I really just want to have you answer it if you don't mind,
Sure.
as briefly as possible. But basically, the question is, you know, how do we make sure students understand the use of AI ethically and responsibly, which I think is being answered, but the more relevant question that I constantly get asked in my role, and I'm sure, you know, with my co-collaborators, UMBC and JHU, should this be a collaborative effort between faculty and administration? And should this include student partners? Like, we often get asked, whose responsibility is it to teach the students about AI? Is it faculty? Is it administration? Is it the students? Is it advising? And I know what my answer would be, but I'd like to know what your answer would be.
Yeah. Oh, you put me on the spot, Dr. Stansbury. So I would say it is us as educators. One, I think it's everyone's responsibility, right? It's parents, it's educators, it's administrators. But for us, we know that our jobs is to educate these students. They are within our care, and the ultimate goal is for them to have success in life after school. We know that the industry, the job market is already requiring these skills, but they're also going to be using this technology in creating their course assignments. So I would love to see an introduction to AI at the beginning of all, undergrads getting into school, and hopefully in K through 12. I already teach it to my granddaughter because I know it's something that she's going to need to know. So I think it's incumbent upon us as educators to not just kind of put our hands up and step back, but to accept this as our responsibility to teach.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your time today. It really has been a pleasure to listen to your talk, to listen to your ideas. So thank you very much for that. And I want to thank everyone, especially our partners. So Hopkins, Mike Reese is on here representing Hopkins today. Henry Mortimer, who is with our Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And then we also have UMBC as part of this collaborative AI and practice series. Because of the success of the series and for the constant attendance that we receive each month, we just want to let you know that we will be continuing into the spring for 3 additional webinars of thought leaders from the field. So thank you for that. Thank you for your participation. And we look forward to seeing you in the spring. Happy holidays. See you later.